Hello, everyone. Welcome back. I am Christine Dixon of The Ordinary Sacred, and I'm so happy you're here. I am going to read a passage from Internal Family Systems Therapy for Shame and Guilt by Martha Sweezy. This might be the last one. There might be one more. And it's been such a wonderful book. And we'll move on to another book after this. But this one is a passage on page 272 entitled Firefighters Deserve a Happy Ending Too. Sometimes we can have really big managing parts inside that really demonize and dislike our firefighters, understandably so, because they can make life for us and other people really difficult. But they also mean well and have good intention. So this is what Martha says. To wrap things up in therapy, protectors who have transgressed, inside or out, need attention too. The ones who hurt other parts are mostly shaming managers. The ones who hurt the body and other people are mostly reactive firefighters. So let's spend a moment right there. I actually have a workshop this coming Friday, March 29th, 2024. Depending on when you're watching this, you might be able to attend. I'll try to remember to put a link in the description. But someone was asking in the workshop, the workshop is called Healing Inner Critics. And they said, are you going to also talk about our critics that face outward toward other people? And I was explaining that's actually a different set of parts that I'm going to go over in another workshop. But essentially, when we have the wounds of shame, right? There was the original incident when something happened, whether it was abuse, neglect, some kind of trauma, conditioning, and then our young, vulnerable parts took on that message. I am bad. I am unlovable. I am too much. I am not enough, right? For this specific reason that they take on. Maybe it's our sensitivity, it's our sexuality, our anger, our neediness, our energy level, whatever it is. That is bad about me. That's the burden that those young parts hold. And then our system organizes after that with these protective parts that can have very different strategies. So our inner critics are the ones who are trying to control us on the inside. And they can often take really intense, harsh measures to do that. Some can be just quietly saying, no, you shouldn't do that. You should do this. And others are saying, you awful, terrible, cussing us out thing. You deserve to die, right? There's different levels and intensities of these critics. I'm going to talk about this in the workshop on Friday. But they are essentially trying to keep those parts exiled so that we can be acceptable socially. And they often are also very critical of our firefighters, which is another subset of protective parts whose strategy is it's so painful on the inside. These parts who hold shame are so painful, and the inner critics are making it worse. There's this toilet bowl of shame I talk about. It's so painful on the inside. I've got to push the pain out, right? So those are the parts that are going to shame and blame other people, maybe act out against them, whether it's saying something they know will hurt them, or trying to control them in some kind of way. Because if I can just control you, then maybe these young vulnerable parts won't get activated, right? And so Martha's explaining the inner critics often transgress against our own parts on the inside and cause a lot of pain. And our firefighters often transgress sometimes against our own bodies, because one role that firefighters take on, or one reason they do what they do, is to soothe the pain. And sometimes this is in the form of distracting from the emotional pain of our exiles, so they might cause pain to our body. This can actually also be an inner critic that can cause pain as a punishment, but a firefighter will cause pain to our body as a distraction from our emotional pain. And we can always go in directly and ask what it's doing. And it will also cause harm to our bodies, say from being addicted to substances or things like that, which a side effect is harm to our body, but their goal is to soothe the overwhelm, the pain from the exiles. And they may also, like I said, focus outward on other people, trying to control them. Their rage may come out on other people and essentially transgress against them because they're protective of us. They're not protective of the other person. Okay, so Martha goes on. When clients see through the eyes of self, parts who have done harm don't seem bad, but they do need to be relieved of their jobs, which happens by healing the exile. Okay, so just like we were talking now, when I'm going like this, it's because I am pointing to the part on the shame cycle. It's like I'm seeing the shame cycle in front of me. There's act one, something bad happens. Then there's the exile, the young part takes on this burden of belief about itself. And then the critics go large, the never again managers, and then we've got the raging firefighters and soothing firefighters. So if you see me pointing, that's what I'm doing. So she's saying that through the eyes of the self, we can see that they're not bad. They all have good intention. They're all protecting the exile, which is right here on the shame cycle. And so because they're all four of these, the two kinds of managers, the two kinds of firefighters are protecting the exile in their own way. The way to help them naturally be able to relax is always to heal the exile, because that's at the root, right? We can't change what happened up here, but we can change the way that these young parts experienced that, what they took on. They can release their burdens. Okay. Let's see. This happens by healing the exile, and the client's self needs to repair the harm that they have done. Yes, there's always repair. Manager parts who remain attached to the idea of punishment, that part is bad, you can't let it off the hook, may not approve of the client taking a benevolent stance toward firefighter parts who have caused problems. Okay, this is a really good point. This is something that I said in a reel I recently made, and I will talk about in the workshop. We can introduce self-energy, sometimes self-like parts who mimic self-energy, to see if the system benefits and can handle it. But sometimes when we do that, when we have compassion, we see the good intention of parts who have legitimately harmed us on the inside or other people on the outside. Our inner critics can say, no, no, no. They feel very threatened by that. You cannot let this part who's caused really, really real harm off the hook, because then their reasoning often is they'll do it again. They'll think it's okay, and we can't have that. But again, this is a very young strategy. This part really means well. It thinks it's effective in getting the firefighter to stop binging, stop raging. And you can even ask, does it work? It might say, yeah, it works a lot of the time, but it sometimes doesn't, and they get really frustrated, and it's really, really difficult. So the self is offering an alternative strategy to often just offering an experiment at first to these inner managing critics. What if you let me listen to these parts, go to what they protect and heal them, and see if it helps them be able to relax? Because we have the same goal. We really do want them to be able to relax and not cause the harm that they are causing. So we have to really become allies with the parts who block the way, meet their concerns, propose experiments to them. And Martha says, but compassion doesn't get anyone off the hook. Accountability and reparations are in order, even when harms are irreparable in the standard sense, but they require persistence and commitment. Okay, and then she's going to give an example. So again, also meeting the concern of this part that having compassion on a firefighter who's done some damage, understanding its good intention and what it protects doesn't mean letting it off the hook. It doesn't mean not making repair. It doesn't mean learning a different way. They're not mutually exclusive. And that's to me a cultural burden that I was handed is if you love someone, you let them do whatever they want to you, right? If you love and understand the good intentions of a part, that means you let it do whatever it wants to do. That's not necessarily the case. You can have love, value for another person or part, and healthy boundaries the same time. All right, so this is an example called Walter's irreparable harm. Walter, a 63-year-old cisgender German English American man who killed a young woman in a crosswalk while driving drunk as a teenager, and soon after made a career in the army, had avoided therapy and struggled with excessive drinking for decades. Twice divorced, he had 2 adult children who would not speak to him. After he retired from the army, his girlfriend urged him to try therapy, and Walter finally agreed. So here's the script. Walter says, "How do you make it right if it can't be right?" Ooh, I feel the desperation in what Walter is saying. I have parts who have taken responsibility for my first husband's death by suicide. And I think it's those that I'm feeling. I'm feeling that empathy for that sentiment. How can you make something right that you cannot make right, that you can't go undo? And Martha says, "What do you hear inside?" Right? It's kind of like, how are your parts or self answering that question? How do you make it right if it can't be right? Walter says, "I hear it cannot be done." Martha says, "And when you hear that, what happens?" Walter says, "I want a drink." Yeah, yeah. So it's that hopelessness, helplessness inside of him. And then this drinking part comes on to help soothe, to help numb him from the pain of that. Martha says, "So if I'm hearing right, when one part poses the question, what can I do to make a repair? Another part says that you can't, and another drinks, or at least wants a drink." And Walter nods. So she's translating what he's saying into parts language for him and checking it out. And Martha says, "And what do you hear between you can't make it right and let's have a drink?" Ooh, interesting that she intuits that there might be something between there. Because Walter says really quickly, "I hear shoot yourself." Okay, so this is so common that binging addictive parts that often use substances like alcohol or drugs, or maybe pornography or gambling or sex or things like that, they are protecting from the kingpin of firefighters, which is suicide. And also, we'll talk about this in the inner critic workshop, but there's a type of inner critic called the destroyer. And when we think of suicidal parts, we often think of parts that say, "I'm so bad, I deserve to die." But a part of that dynamic can also be that there's this really, really big inner critic that says, "You deserve to die. Kill yourself," right? And it's, Dick Shorts will call it sometimes a murderous part, right? And I've had a couple of these in my life. And it's really, really painful for the system. There are parts who believe it's kind of like in the shame cycle, right? There's the part who believes I am this terrible person. I did this terrible thing that cannot be repaired. I'm helpless and hopeless. I am bad. I am so, so bad for this. Cannot release that burden. And then there's this critic that says, you are so bad. You took a life. You deserve to die. Shoot yourself, right? So Walter's system makes complete sense here. It's totally an example of the shame cycle. This terrible thing happened. His part took on this belief, I am legitimately bad. I am a murderer, right? Then these critics came in and said, yes, you are bad. And that pain of that shame spiral there, a firefighter came in and said, I'm going to protect you from that. I'm going to soothe you by drinking. And what a lot of people don't understand when they try to convince, when their own managers try to convince another person's addictive firefighters to stop numbing out, that suicide is the next in line, right? And that's the dynamic that it's protecting from. Okay. So Martha says, which of these parts need your attention first? This is often a good question as a practitioner when you're aware that there are many parts in a dynamic that are showing up. Walter says, I don't know. So Martha says, let's invite them all to a summit meeting with you. Let's bring them all in. Are they willing? Walter nods. And Martha says, are you with them? Walter nods. Do they see you? Walter says, no. So Martha says, would they like to see you? Walter says, no. And Martha says, who do they think you are? He says, a drunk. Okay. So I love this. First, do they see you? And if the answer is no, would they like to? Right? And then the answer is also no. Okay, who do they see? Who do they think you are? And he says a drunk. And this really gives understanding to who they're seeing. So it sounds like he's maybe blended with the part who seeks alcohol to numb, and that's who they're seeing. So Martha says, ask the drunk part to sit in a chair next to you so that they can see you. So Walter nods and goes inside and does this. And Martha says, how do they respond? Walter says, they don't know me. Martha says, well, what do you say to them? Walter says, hey, I'm here. You guys haven't figured this out. Maybe I can help. Why blackball me? Um, this sounds like self, or at least a self-like part. The tenderness with which he's kind of saying it. And yeah, so Martha says, what do they say? Walter says, they are interested. Okay, good. It sounds like it's probably self. Because the parts, if it's not self, say it's a self-like part that is just kind of having an agenda around getting them to stop doing what they're doing, they will not respond well. They'll see right through it. So the fact that they respond well is a great sign. Walter says they're interested. Martha says, ask who needs your attention first. Walter says, the guy who says I can't do anything. And Martha says, how do you feel toward him? Walter says, I don't like him. So another part has come in response. And Martha says, would the part who doesn't like him let you talk with him? Walter nods. And Martha says, how do you feel now? Walter says, I'm asking, what makes you so sure that I can't help? That's a good question. It sounds genuinely curious, right? Tell me why you think I can't help. Martha says, and Walter says, should I tell you this? And he pauses. He yells at me. She's dead, you dumb fuck. Shoot yourself. You can apologize in heaven. Ooh, yeah. So I noticed big emotions, parts in me that really relate because I've had really big inner critics who will say something similar to me like this. So again, this is the destroyer part in him. So it's interesting that the one who's saying there's nothing can be done and the one who's saying shoot yourself is the same part. And it kind of makes sense that that part, that's the only thing that part thinks can be done. There's nothing else that can be done. They're feeling pretty helpless. So Martha says, so he thinks that you're the teenage driver? Walter says, I guess so. And Martha says, how do you feel toward him now, Walter? Walter says, he thinks that I ruined his life, and I agree. And this confirms that this angry part, this big inner critic, destroyer part, sees Walter as the drunk driver teenager, and that he may be blended also with that part. Because he's saying, you know, I agree. And so then Martha kind of steps in here and says, it's true, you can't undo the decisions of an impulsive teenager or bring that young woman back to life. But let's do a thought experiment for a moment. What is a fitting repair for a permanent harm? Okay, so this is interesting. I think Martha's aware that this is a really intense dynamic, and she's seeing this destroyer, murderous inner part, and this incredibly vulnerable teenage boy who made this irreparable choice. And so herself is offering an experiment to them. Because whenever you are guiding someone else in a session, there's that person's self, and they're all their parts and yourself, and often your parts that are chiming in too, right? And so you're all there together. So now herself is talking to these parts and kind of asking this question, what would be a fitting repair for a permanent harm? And Walter says, I don't know. I wish I knew. And then there's a long pause, and he says, an eye for an eye, maybe. So that's likely what that destroyer part is thinking, right? You took a life, you deserve to die. Eye for an eye, right? I mean, doing something on the life side of the ledger, he says. I was in the army for 20 years, you know, Afghanistan, Iraq, but I never shot anyone. I am certain of that. I knew that I wouldn't hurt someone under any circumstances, that I didn't talk about it. They would have kicked me out of the army. Oh, that's so interesting. So even though he was in the army, there was a part who was burdened by this experience that was determined to not take a life. Martha says, okay, let's keep going with this experiment. That decision was on the life side of the ledger. What are you going to do next? And Walter thinks for a few beats and says, I can take care of animals. And Martha says, how does that sound? And Walter begins to cry and says, yeah, I would be grateful. I love animals. Oh, I'm feeling emotional about this. Um, so Martha says, after this session, Walter found a shelter for injured wild animals where he could volunteer. He also joined a group that traveled around the globe to rescue animals who had been injured in oil spills. He did not stop feeling guilty about the death he had caused, that he did build a community and stop drinking. And he did feel that he was making a repair every day. So it's kind of just proposing an alternative strategy. What if instead of my life for this other person's life, like the suicidal or destroyer part was saying, what if I could live my life in as a proponent of life, encouraging life, supporting life in different ways, and then that could be some kind of reparation, right? I know that if you've seen some of my other videos, I've had a part who believe that I deserve to be in pain as a punishment, and suicidal parts that believe that I deserve to die. And in many ways, I think the work that I do here, with IFS, YouTube videos, with workshops, with leading groups, is a way for me to give back to the life. What does he say? The ledger of life. And I remember I wrote a book a while back, and I talked about wanting these things to be known by my first husband's 5-year-old self, that I'm often offering this to my young parts, his young parts, my children's young parts, everyone's young parts, that if people could know beyond a shadow of a doubt that they are loved, that every part of you is loved, that every part of you makes sense. That's kind of my contribution to the ledger of life. Anyway, that was a unexpectedly moving example for me and my system, and I'm curious what you thought of it. If you have any comments or if you have any questions, feel free to leave them in the comments below.